What is going on, guys? Bark Devoten here, and today I'm gonna do something I've never done before. I don't know if it's gonna work, but I'm gonna give it a shot. So, on Blue Sky, the only social media other than YouTube that I have now, I primarily follow legal scholars, actual legal professors, anyone who I would think is a legal professional, whether someone has been a prosecutor, whether in private or for state purposes, federal purposes, things like that. I've always tried on social media from the beginning when I first logged on to like Facebook or Twitter, which I no longer have, to keep my feed balanced. But I have found that as we go into a second Trump admin, to find that none of the fun stuff really matters at this point. Um, a good analogy I heard is that when your house is on fire, you're not really thinking about the renovations at that moment. And so I posed this question and I tagged a bunch of the legal scholars that I follow on Blue Sky. And basically, what I said is that in a legal system that is fundamentally separated from the idea of justice applies to all equally, how exactly does participating in that system's framework going to fix it, specifically when one political party does not care about supporting it? And as a subtext, I said, help us non legal scholars understand this idea being perpetrated post Trump's second admin. And the reason I post this is that a lot of these legal scholars, legal professors, some are still like active prosecutors or defenders. They are posting a lot of the same idea that I see throughout a lot of um, left leaning social media posts and maybe even left wing newspapers and news sites where it's basically, take heart. The night is darkest right before the dawn. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Right? Like I don't see it. Like I truly don't. And yes, Trump's second admin is hasn't started yet. And within the coalition of the Republican Party, they have, a fracturing of goals and how to go about those goals. And basically, what I'm trying to get at is that how are we going? Let me preface this, give you a little context. Democrats in general always say things like Biden says, like, we do our fighting at the ballot box. And I'm like, that's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard. We didn't win World War II at the ballot box, right? Like, that's not how it works. We didn't invade Iraq because of the ballot box, right? And I'm not saying Iraq is a success. Obviously, that is a complete fucking disaster. My point being is that you you don't take down dictators and tyrants at the ballot box. Like fucking Russia and China are two perfect examples how that doesn't work. And so I fail to see those with a much more intimate understanding and practical application of the law within our American system, how they are able to see this. Now, Professor Jen Taub posted this. I posted that like an hour ago, and I think like half hour ago, she posted this specific link, not to my question, just with a heart symbol. And I clicked on it, and again, I may just be connecting two dots that don't actually connect here. I don't know that I expect any legal professional with their, worth their salt to reply on social media to someone named Verdict of Odin, right? Like that's kind of a that's a bit of a stretch there, especially when I'm tagging like a bunch of them, um, with a question that has a very set, presupposition to it, right? But a presupposition that I argue is factual, and we have seen it played out time and time again. That our legal system fundamentally does not apply equally to all, specifically to the fascist who just got voted in and who is surrounding himself with Christian fundamentalists and neo Nazis. So, anyway, after this long speech, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to play a windowed Solasta as we listen to Global Existential Challenges, Designing Mechanisms for Addressing Political Polarization in Vote Behavior. Now, what that in itself, that's a catching headline for someone like me, but also the professor here is a professor of neuroscience and an associate professor of political science at Queens College. Both of these presenters, if anyone has been on this channel in the last couple of years, neuroscience has been an obsessive hobby of mine for the past 3 or 4 years. Big fan of Dr. Paul Bloom. If you haven't read any of his books, I highly suggest it. I highly suggest also reading his direct research. Really, really amazing. But I'm going to go ahead because I don't know. I have Firefox. I don't use Google. I don't use Microsoft products. I use a VPN. I don't use anything, trackers and ad block and all that crap. So there's no way that I know without like an extension to pop this in front of Solasta if I full screen it. So I'm going to try to do this. Let's see if it works.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Yashar. I am the director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, Pierce, and also a professor in the politics department and SPIA, the Public Policy School. And it's really great to see all of you today for today's Global Existential Challenges seminar. For those who've been watching this and looking online, this particular semester we focused on democracy around the globe. Especially given that 2024 is oftentimes understood as the year of elections that have happened, all around the world, and oftentimes with rising concerns going into those elections about polarization, populism, democratic backsliding, erosion, and the like, and oftentimes some hope for democratic resilience in that context. So this has been a year just pregnant with debates about democracy in many parts of the world. Last month, we had a terrific panel that was focused on elections, comparing Africa with Latin America, with South Asia. That was a really interesting panel with colleagues who were visiting as part of our advisory council. But obviously, this is a debate and a concern that doesn't just focus on places beyond, but also is very present in our own context. In the United States, obviously, we just had an important election where many of these concerns about polarization and the like were at the forefront before the election and remain on our minds today. So today's panel is really incredibly good timing to think about these sorts of questions. And I should say it grew out of an unexpected conversation that happened, I believe, in August when I ran into Sam Levin. And I was talking with him about his work this summer, and he mentioned that he was working with Sam Wang, particularly focused on many of these questions. And we thought that this would be a great opportunity to bring them to Pierce, which is a space for multidisciplinary conversations around these critical issues. And so today's panel really is the consequence of that conversation. And we're so delighted to have these two innovative scholars with a footnote that I'll come back to in a moment, whose interest in contemporary politics is profound and is actually informed by a very multidisciplinary training. So let me mention the two speakers, as I said, with a caveat at the end, and then our discussant. So first off, Simon Levin, whose name is here on the screen, is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Princeton. He's actually a mathematician by training, but for those of you who know him, you know that he has a very multidisciplinary orientation. He has collaborated with colleagues all across the campus and beyond. And his publication record, I'm not even going to try and summarize it. Since this year alone, he's co-authored 15 articles. Last year, some 22. He is a prolific scholar, but we're really bringing him to the table today because of his work broadly on polarization and cooperation, thinking about individual and collective behavior. Sam Wang is the professor of neuroscience here at Princeton. He is also extremely well known to all of you. His research and lab investigates how brains learn from sensory experience in adulthood and development with relevance, particularly for a wide range of topics, including autism. He has also been actively involved in analyzing and engaging US politics as a scholar and a public intellectual, been involved in many different kinds of organizations, including Princeton Election Consortium and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Perhaps you've even heard him on the radio at different moments around election time as we've thought about gerrymandering in this context. So I want to start off by saying we are so fortunate to have both of these speakers on the table. However, unfortunately, Sam was not able to come today. I'm sorry, Simon. Sam is here. Simon was not able to come today. Unexpectedly, something has occurred, so he's not here personally. Although he has shared his slides, obviously as a long-time collaborator with Sam, who is here for the presentation. So Sam is going to speak for some 45 minutes about the work that they're doing collaboratively. And then we are so fortunate to have Kina Lipsitz, who's our discussant. She's a professor of political science at Queens College and City University of New York, but also is a resident of Princeton and also very much involved in our community here. She's a political scientist whose research focuses on elections and campaigns, political behavior, and the like. And she's the author of 3 books, amongst many other articles. Let me just note one is The Competitive Elections in the American Voter. Another is Campaigns and Elections, Rules, Reality, Strategy, and Choice. And a third is Democracy at Risk. So we're going to bring a political scientist to the table to engage in these conversations. But Kina also is very multidisciplinary in her orientation, having collaborated and written with scholars and colleagues across the board, including in engineering. And so we are ready for a really interesting conversation. Overall, we're teeing up interesting debates about polarization, institutions, and norms. And we really want to thank them for coming here. So Sam will speak first. Kina then will follow up. They will then come up to this table and we'll go forward. One final thing, which is that some of our seminars are taped. This is one of those seminars that's actually being taped, so I want you to be mindful of the fact that we're taping and it will ultimately be posted online. And with that, let's give them a warm applause.
We'll just be in the booth. There's a movie, and I'm going to need you to play. When I ask her, I'm going to need you to play the movie, okay? Oh, I can do it from here.
Yes, do you need to connect this?
No. I just when the time comes, will I be able to play the movie from here?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay, terrific. All right.
And if not, I'll be back there.
Thanks very much. Good to see you. All right. Okay, thanks very much for coming out this week after the election. Very timely at this moment in American history. I apologize that Simon's not here. I've been working with Simon for a couple of years now, and it's been a real pleasure. And I feel not entirely equal to the task of showing how he views these problems, but I'm going to do my best, and hopefully you'll get a small snapshot of a small perspective on how he sees things. Okay, our topic today is at its root political polarization, which is a topic that is very much on people's minds these days. And I want to do something kind of go all the way from mathematical biology and ecology and how assemblages of people and animals and even molecules work together to generate what are called emergent phenomena. And then I want to zoom in and get very specific on the topic of our destination topic today, political polarization, and hopefully even end up with what we can do about it and ways to understand it better to eventually bring about practical solutions to these problems. So it's an ambitious topic, and in 40 minutes, who knows, maybe we'll get partway there. So as Simon puts it here, the topics that he knits together in his view are public goods, social externalities, and political polarization. And so if I could go ahead and have the next slide, or do I do that here? I can do it. Okay, all right, good. Okay, so the way that Simon would put it is that public goods problems come up all the time in nature. They come up down here in the lower left is an example of a tragedy of the commons, which is a phrase popularized by Hardin. The idea that a pasture can be grazed over and then no longer usable by anyone. And then on the right, I believe, is a termite mound that Carol Levin took a photograph of. And this is an example of a social good that came together from termites cooperating with one another. And so that would be a positive social good that comes together. And Darwin noticed that these things came up over and over again. And so in a widespread sense, public goods problems are not constrained to our species. They appear in species, all kinds of species, in all kinds of ecological contexts. Now, erosion of public goods threatens our security. If you think about the kinds of resources we have in the world, we have natural capital, which the sustainability of which has become a real issue in recent years. And this unusual period of relative world peace that we had in the last half century or so is a public good that perhaps we take for granted or we undernotice because of the conflicts that do exist around the world that, of course, we are very concerned about. And today, our topic is democratic governance. And just on the right here is this slide here is a graph showing one kind of public good that is starting to become scarce. The idea that in Middle East and North African lands, the renewable resources are starting to deplete, and that is for a variety of reasons. But this is an example of a crisis that's become quite prominent in recent years. Now, today the topic is democratic governance, and democratic governance, too, is something that's eroding worldwide. And this is a worldwide survey that's done of democratic norms, and this is an index of democracy index score that showed a slight improvement in 2022, but actually has been generally on the decline since 2006. And you can see here that the United States, where we live, is classified here as a flawed democracy, and I think probably most of us in this room would probably agree with that, and we're about to learn more about that in the next few years, I think. But the idea here is that you can see that there's a variety of nations that call themselves democracies or do not call themselves democracies, and you can see that there is a pretty large range of authoritarian countries around the world. So this erosion is a public good that is, in fact, of significant concern. Now, here in the United States, this is a little bit more complicated, and it's also not entirely up to date. But you can see here that, in fact, this has been a time of a lot of change in the United States. You see this dark green curve that is attractively increasing. So let's focus on the positive. Political participation went up during the first Trump administration. Their index of government integrity that's gone down a bit. But you can see here that there have been a lot of changes against a downward trajectory, and you know, this graph is incomplete. And I will say that one question is, where is this graph naturally headed in the next few years? And then the second question is, what can we do to nudge this graph and perhaps get it to move in a direction that is to the benefit of as many people as possible in the United States and in the world? So, to zoom out to a theoretical point, this is just a broad point that goes well beyond the particular crisis of democracy, that the world is filled with complex adaptive systems. And generally speaking, I want you to think just very generally about any kind of ecological system, a democracy, a school of fish, you know, I don't know, molecules in a gas, as being heterogeneous collections of individual units, and in the case of living things, agents, that interact locally and evolve based on the outcome. So you can imagine, for instance, that if you have fish that can only see the fish next to them and see that the fish next to them is a certain orientation, and then the fish says, okay, I'll face the same way. Even though that fish cannot see other fish that are very far away, the emergent phenomenon is it forms a school of fish that's all going in one direction, and you can get flocking behavior, schooling behavior. And that's an example of an emergent phenomenon that is driven by individual interactions, and the evolution of the entire system is based on the outcomes of those interactions. And I want you to think about democracy as being one of these systems that we'll get into, hopefully, in the next few minutes and in discussion with Kino Lipsitz. So emergence comes up in all kinds of problems. And just to give you one more example, economic behavior is similarly an emergent phenomenon. And so economics comes from, you know, everything from microeconomic behavior, where we make decisions about how to spend our money, how we're feeling, how happy we are, how sad we are in our personal lives, the things that we encounter in our environments, and all kinds of factors. And eventually they merge to form this emergent phenomenon of macroeconomic behavior. And so if you imagine the decisions that you make about whether to buy gas, or how you feel about the price of eggs, or whatever it might be, or how you feel about your family situation, whatever it might be, you and millions of others are making those decisions, and together they form the animal spirits of the entire economy. Now, what I would say is that Simon is interested in, and I am interested in, the same approach, and this is really what drew us together as collaborators, the idea that it is possible to have macroscopic features. If we could understand these local interactions, maybe we could have some insights into where the emergent phenomena come from, right? So political scientists have certainly been doing this quite a lot over the decades and the centuries. And we come at it from a mathematical biology standpoint of understanding these interacting agents and trying to understand what the irreducible components are that lead to the large-scale macroscopic features. And so, you know, on the one hand, we care very much about the macroscopic features. On the other hand, we hope to capture the essentials and figure out which components are essential, and then thereby have a proper theory of where these macroscopic emergent phenomena, such as political polarization, come from. And then thereby, as I said, understand causes, understand how those causes link to effects, and hopefully understand how perturbations and interventions could also perhaps make a small difference. Now, okay, so I already mentioned the tragedy of the commons. This is a phrase originated by Garrett Hardin, and he proposed in I think a rigorous game theoretic sense that if we all have some common resource and we are rewarded by taking a little bit of that resource, and there's no immediate motivation to replenish that resource, then that commons gets depleted. And so that was a pioneering idea by Garrett Hardin. To some extent, this was countered or expanded by Elinor Ostrom, and Professor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize in Economics for understanding ways in which societies can cooperate, ways in which agents can work together, and this idea of somehow improving the commons through interactions, through a phrase that here is mutual coercion, but mutually agreed upon. So if we agree to form a society and we agree to abide by those norms, then it's possible to create a society that enriches the commons. And that is a central challenge of how to build a democracy and how to keep it strong. So, so I would say that here, this is an article that Naomi Leonard and Simon wrote together on collective intelligence as a public good. And so what they claim and what I present to you is that what's needed at this point at this juncture in our history is cooperation in the public good, some kind of collective intelligence that is greater than the intelligence of us as individuals, because we are forced to live with one another. And so if we can find some way to live together collectively, then that would lead to that collective good. And a dose of pro-sociality in helping to deal with kinds of inequities that come up. Here shown in the slide is intergenerational, so, you know, across the country, across different economic strata, but also between generations, right? Changes that happen over time. And instead, what we have is the opposite. We have phenomena that are well known, I think, to everyone in this room. Extreme nationalist movements, which we've seen around the world, as Deborah has pointed out. This is the year of elections, and and over again, a theme is nationalism that's emerged in various ways across the globe in different countries and on different continents. And of course, political polarization. And so there's this general question, why is this happening everywhere? It can't just be because of trans issues in schools or whatever it might be, because it's a phenomenon that's happening everywhere. So there's something globally happening, and it's like we have all these, I don't know, to make a physics analogy, we have these pistons, and the piston is getting hotter and the gas is getting compressed all over the world. So what is the common theme that's going on there? And so one hopes that it might be possible to come up with some common causes that transcend the specific issues that come up in our country and in other countries. Not to belittle those issues, but they are clearly important details, but they might not be at the root of what's going on. Okay, so the question is there a solution? Now, as I've already told you, political polarization is on the increase and threatens democratic governance. This is a slide and a report that came out before last week's election, but I think this report is perhaps more timely than ever. But the idea that there's increasing ideological uniformity within groups, say within political parties, and antipathy between the major parties in the United States. And this report I recommend to you as a report that summarizes how these qualities affect politics, compromise, and even everyday life. For those of you who vote here in Princeton Township, you know that even school board elections can be subject to these national forces. And so these things come up over and over and over again at every level. And so, like Tolstoy said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Okay, so here's Simon. This is all you get of Simon, so take a good look at that photograph. There he is. Simon has, as I said, been interested in this for increasingly in the last few years, and I had the pleasure of attending a conference in Arizona a few years ago, and Keena and I were, how many years ago was that conference? Before in the before time, yeah. But that conference and another sibling conference here at Princeton led to a special issue of PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, all about the dynamics of political polarization. And these three members of the Academy, Simon, Helen Milner, and Charles Perrings, put together a series of contributions by us, Keena and me, and a cast of all-stars, all looking at political polarization in their own way from political science and from other disciplines, trying to understand what it is that causes this polarization and what its consequences are. And there's an idea I want to introduce here. The idea I want to introduce is the idea of low dimensionality. And so this is an article that George Hagstrom and Simon wrote together. The idea that dynamics can become unstable under certain circumstances. So imagine a complex system that moves in many dimensions, like there's lots of things it can do, you know, whatever it may be, a school of fish or a political system. And now imagine everything in that system starting to move in one dimension. Okay, so in physics, we would call that a manifold, a one-dimensional path, and everything is forced to stay along that single dimension. When dynamics are forced to go along a single dimension, there's no place for the dynamics to go. And so you might imagine, for instance, that a school of fish, if they're swimming at random without regard to one another, they're not going to get very far. But if they swim together with local interactions, the emergent phenomenon is that their movement becomes one-dimensional and in a single path sense, so not a straight line, but a manifold, a path, in which they can start making some progress and go someplace. So the general idea in this article is that there are precursors of critical transitions that come from the following idea. When you have a one-dimensional system and dynamics are forced to go along that system, instability can result. Because on the one hand, you can make progress. On the other hand, you might end up someplace really unexpected. And so in the dynamics of a complex system, if you have a single-dimensional manifold, you can imagine that maybe an avalanche could result, or in heart tissue, a heart attack might result, or in a society, a political revolution might result. And so when we have single-dimensional dynamics, unexpected things can happen, and sometimes they can be catastrophic. And if you think about political polarization as it is now in the United States and in other countries, you can see the beginnings of, I think, where we're headed today in this discussion, the idea that dynamics start falling along a single dimension, as we've seen over the last 30 years or so, right? I would personally characterize it as really picking up steam in the mid-90s, that that low-dimensional manifold is a physics way or a mathematical biology way of thinking about where we've gotten. Now, I would say that this is not just an abstraction and not just an academic exercise. My hope is to show you that this is also a powerful way to think about political dynamics and a way to, for a math nerd like me, to understand many of the findings that have emerged from political science and turn them into a theory that we in our little corner of knowledge could understand as a way of modeling the entire system as a complex system and understanding how we got here and where we might go next. And so I hope that what I'm going to show you is something that's complementary to all the knowledge that's come before from complex systems and also from political science. So I think Keena, Professor Lipsitz, is going to get into this a little bit, so I will just use this as put a pin in something for us to think about, that there are different ways to think about polarization. So if you don't think about it for a living, I want you to think about different ways of thinking about polarization. This is a book that Nolan McCarty over in Politics and SPIA wrote about, and this is a whole book about polarization, so I recommend it to you. But one kind of polarization is, I think, one that comes to mind, which is ideological. How do you feel about abortion? How do you feel about guns? How do you feel about Ukraine? How do you feel about Gaza? Okay, so there's different ways that we can think about polarization that are focused on issues. And let us call that whole collection of attitudes ideological. And, you know, it can be different kinds of polarization. It can be how much do you trust authority? Or it can be, you know, how do you care more about your neighbors or about people far away from you? There's different ways to think about polarization, and some of them are ideological. Another way to think about polarization is something that I think that has probably been really, in many ways, quite wrenching over the last few decades: affective polarization. The idea that it's not just that I feel a certain way about an issue, it's that I feel very positively about my side, and I feel very negatively about your side. And if you look back in the 1990s, some of the political language that was introduced by the strategist Frank Luntz involved things like calling the opponents sick and twisted, right? If you think about that, those were things that were not said at all by Republican Minority Leader Bob Michel. But Newt Gingrich, who eventually became Speaker of the House, was embraced those words, like the idea that by using affect, you could then polarize voters so that a voter might say, you know what, I'm not 100% sure I like my side, but that other side, oh, they're a bunch of degenerates. I'm not going to vote for them. And whichever side you may be on, I hope I've described this in a way that captures, you can imagine supporters of either major political party having a sentiment like what I just said. So both.
So I'm going to stop there for just a quick moment, because he touched on a subject that I've actually talked about before, and it had to do with the science of speaking. And who he was referring to, Dr. Frank Luntz, was the speechwriter for Newt Gingrich. And this is what he's referring to back in the 90s when, you know, the story goes that Bill Clinton told Gingrich, you know, when he was on Air Force One, he sat him in the back or something, or he was perturbed and whatever. Anyway, so the story goes that Gingrich was like, fuck this guy, the gloves are off. And he basically hired Dr. Frank Luntz, who has, I want to say, and don't hold me to this because I could be wrong, I thought his profession was neuroscience, but specifically with how speaking and how language changes the way we interpret, or our perception is changed on certain things. Very much like the example Professor Wang just said right there, is basically up until that time, there was no real, in the federal highlight of political actors in American politics, there was no sort of denigration of the other side in such a way. And this is also, and the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I listened to what I would call, I read his book, The Political Brain, by Dr. Drew Weston, who probably is still friends with Dr. Luntz. They are like basically two sides of the same coin, where Dr. Drew Weston, you know, worked with Hillary Clinton's campaign on how to best approach a positive mindset in terms of advertising a political campaign, which did not work, and did not work for her. It didn't work for Harris. Like, the flip side of that coin to Dr. Luntz, who is referring to basically the idea of dehumanizing and degrading the other side in such a way that makes anyone even remotely unsure about voting for that person, kind of pushes them over the fence. And the acceleration in American politics, as we've seen with the election of Donald Trump twice now, is that Republicans at this point, they just want to vote for the biggest asshole in the room, the biggest bully on the courtyard, because there's so many other people around him that want to be would-be bullies. They want to bully themselves into power, and that's why they become his cronies, and they echo his talking points, and why the Republican Party has fractured in many ways during this time. I would say, you know, really started with the Tea Party directly after the election of Barack Obama. Anyway, so I just kind of wanted to highlight that a little bit. If any of you, you know, on the 0.00001 chance that you remember me kind of going off about these two professors of language who got involved in politics and who I think are very influential to this day. Obviously, Luntz having a much greater impact due to, anger, as with, anger leads to the dark side. That is why the Sith are powerful. That is why the Sith, gain power so quickly and why so many flock to them out of fear, out of anger, primarily out of fear, but also that need for power that they have to have it, right? So anyway.
Ideological and affective polarization are associated with a loss of dimensionality and extreme spread along one or a small number of axes. There are ways in which this can be measured. I think Kina will talk about that a bit. There are ways which they can be measured that we're working on right now. There's a lot of survey data, and where I'm headed in today's talk presentation is to show you how you can actually get this out of real voting behavior. So not just from survey data, which is the classical central tool in the kit of political scientists, but I'm going to show you how actual voting data can be used to extract the same concept. But the idea that dimensionality in American politics has gone low, and we are along a single axis or a single path, a single manifold in space. So some polarization is likely to be good. So for instance, it's helpful to have a choice between parties, and it's helpful to have a contrast of choices. These are political contests are made of these contrasts. As Barry Goldwater said, a choice, not an echo. But too much polarization could be destructive to societies. And I think a good question right now at this point in American history is how much polarization is too much, and is there something that can be done about it? This is just to remind me to tell you about some of the many good things that are in this issue of PNAS, and I really encourage it to you. It's a virtual online issue. I tried without luck to get a hard copy of the whole issue, but it just goes to show that I'm kind of old-fashioned. But here is one of multiple articles. This one's interesting because it's about a variety of factors, but including spatial clustering. And if you think about the rural-urban divide that has emerged in US politics, that perhaps is relevant to this particular study done by these collaborators here about segregation and clustering of preferences, and how that clustering of preferences can erode socially beneficial coordination. And so this is just one example of ways in which it's helpful to, in some ways, abstract the nature of polarization, and without getting into the details, whether they be about COVID or guns or whatever it might be, that there's this broad principle that as we come to live further apart from one another, which Bill Bishop called the big sort, and which researchers have delved into over in the decades since that book came out, the idea that in fact that big sort could be a root cause of where we are now in terms of polarization. Now, I want to now turn to, now that I've set the stage using Simon's slides, I'm now going to turn to my slides, and I'm going to show you now how my students and I have been starting to work on the question of political polarization, and we have practical ambitions, and so for purposes of today, I decided to call this talk "A Republic If We Can Keep It." This is a famous saying that emerged at the founding, and what I'm hoping to show you is some way of whether the tools get used or not, I cannot say, but at least to understand the phenomena and to at least begin the concept of building a science of democracy repair. And I'm purposely using the word repair and not reform, because reform has political valence, but repair, certainly I think, is understandable, right? Like there are things that are not quite working right, looking a little bit rickety, maybe we'd like to repair them. And it's not that we want a particular political outcome, it's that we want the system to continue working, right? So, if you voted for, a meta vote, you may have voted for the ability to vote again in the future. And that ability to vote again in the future involves having a system in which all the major players in the system are willing to admit the possibility that they might lose. And so democracy in its core means a system that's responsive to the voters and representative of the voters. And so that's where I'm headed to get in the remaining minutes. Okay, so just to remind you, we live in a somewhat unusual political time. This is now a graph. I haven't had time to update it to make it pretty. You can see that I added something to it that that goes off the edge of the graph. I apologize at the homeliness of this graph. But this is a graph of presidential elections from John Quincy Adams to the second election of Donald Trump. And this is the popular vote margin of whoever ended up becoming president. And so the idea here is that, that we live in a period of close presidential elections where the popular vote has been within 5 points in 6 out of the last 7 elections, and this last one was a real close one, looking like less than 2 percentage points, about 1 percentage point. And you can see here that the red dots are even times when the popular vote loser became president, whether it be John Quincy Adams on the left, or Rutherford Hayes and Benjamin Harrison in the first Gilded Age, and then George W. Bush and the first Trump presidency in the second, let's call it perhaps the second Gilded Age. So the reason I'm showing this to you is to remind you that we live in a pretty unusual time. Elections have been on a knife edge, not just the presidency, but also control of Congress. So control of Congress changed multiple times during the first Gilded Age. And this has to do with close national votes among people who were allowed to vote back then and among people who voted this time. During those times, elections have been actually quite close. But in addition to that, we also have these other themes that I think are familiar to all of you, themes of racial division, technological disruption, increasing inequality, and deep partisanship. And I should add to this that this time around, there's a strong separation in issues between the major parties where there's very little overlap. And what that means is that a small change in vote can lead to a large change in policy outcome. And if you think about what just happened last week, it's a close election. The House couldn't be more closely divided. The presidency was decided by fewer than 100 electoral votes. That was a close election. And yet the consequences are, going to be pretty profound. And so that idea of a small change in vote leading to a large change in outcome illustrates the kind of instability that can result when you have a system that in fact rewards, winning by any means. It makes me think of, we were talking before and about in some Hemingway story or novel, the question, how did you go bankrupt? Well, gradually and then suddenly. Okay, so, we might be at the sudden part now. So there's different ways to look at this. The January 6th insurrection was a profound event in American politics and one that I think really shaped a lot of people's thinking about where we're headed. And I really recommend to you this article that came out just 3 days after it, which I, was quite surprised to see it come out so suddenly. But as I've come to learn about the work of Timothy Snyder, he's somebody who's really understood these things quite well. He's the author of the book On Tyranny. And you can see here, these are people who feel left out in one way or another. Whatever the merits of their positions are, these are people who feel that the system's not working for them, and they feel that they deserve to win, and they feel that they were robbed, and they wanted to do whatever it took to win. That's one path that we could go down. There it is. Then another path down here is a path that I would characterize as one driven by reform. This is a candidate forum at an Alaska congressional forum several years ago, at which Sarah Palin ran against Nick Begich and Mary Peltola, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, although Peltola worked for a Republican congressman for many years. And so here they are taking a selfie together. And if you've been following American politics, you might be a little bit surprised to see Sarah Palin taking a selfie with someone of the opposing party. And one of the things that happened during this was that there was an implementation of a particular reform called ranked choice voting, which I will come back to. But it was a special primary system called Top 4, in which everyone ran in one primary, and it was a special decision rule called ranked choice voting. And after just the second iteration of this rule, Palin started buddying up to 2 people who she was saying bad things about. I mean, I got to say, there was a triangular, it was like that end scene from Reservoir Dogs. It was like, there was a lot of hostility between people the first time around, but it actually got a little bit better the second time around. And so one question is it possible to perform an intervention that goes from what's on the left here to what's on the right? Okay, so I want to now introduce to you a paradox. This paradox is we're polarized, but yet many of us are independents. How many of you, just curious, how many of you, you don't have to answer if you don't want to. This is, how many of you are registered neither Democratic nor Republican, but are registered as unaffiliated with either major party? Okay, some. All right, it's interesting. Fewer than I would have expected. I will say that that right now, in the most recent Gallup survey, 51% of respondents report themselves to be neither Democrats nor Republicans. And that means that they outnumber Democrats and Republicans combined in the United States. And that's something that has emerged this year. And you can see that this dotted line, which is independence, has gone up and up and up. And the most recent result is 51%. So this is a funny paradox. 51% of people say that they're independent, but we're really polarized. And there's affective polarization and issue polarization. So what? We hate each other, we think the other side is scum, and, or pardon me, that'll be the strongest word I use today, I hope. But at the same time, 51% report that they're independent. How can that possibly be? And I want to show you how that could possibly be. So imagine, this is just a simple visualization. Imagine that we have, let's see if I can do this myself. This is very exciting. Okay, great. So imagine voters piled up in a histogram, and you might imagine, and this kind of histogram will become more familiar to you, perhaps with Kina's slides, but imagine us piled up in two great piles on the histogram, on the left and on the right, ideologically separated from another. So, but now imagine that actually we're more complex than that as a people, that we are in fact, let me see if we can do this. Okay, this is like gonna be, can I do it? Yeah, okay, it's playing. All right, so imagine now that we're actually multidimensional. In fact, some of us are not in one of those two mountains. So some of us are in this third mountain. Now, I've shown this third mountain as being smaller than the other two, but these are voters who are perhaps unrepresented by the two major mountains. It's a polarized system, and they don't really feel like they're part of either, but they still have to choose. And if you imagine a single axis, then they have to make a choice where they have to project whatever their hopes and dreams and views are onto the principal dimension. And that dimension is this principal dimension of polarization. And so they get forced to choose. So it's possible to be heterogeneous in our views, and yet also be forced to choose in a system. And if the rules of the system force us to choose, then it creates a problem. It creates tension in the system. And so this visualization is to just show you that idea. Now, I would posit to you, and this is me coming as a non-political scientist, just naive ideas about what we would want out of a democracy. We might want a democracy to represent us. And so for years, I worked on gerrymandering, and I'm going to say something contrary, perhaps suitable for discussion later. In some ways, the gerrymandering problem has been actually addressed in many ways in the last 10 years. Not every way. There are some pretty bad gerrymanders in the US. But representation is one way in which we would like our democracy to work for us. We'd like to be represented. And there's been improvement in that domain. We'd like the system to be responsive to us. And as you've heard me say, responsive, but maybe not too responsive. And the question is hyper-responsive, right? In neurology, we refer to reflexes as being hyper-reflexive. You want to have a reflex, but if you've ever been to a neurology exam, being hyper-reflexive is not a good sign. It's too much reflex. And finally, deliberative. We'd like our democracy, our system to be deliberative and resolve issues at the hands of the people who we elect. So how could we build those using the rules of the system? This is now a math person's view of what political scientists think about how the system works. And this is done with Professor Lipsitz and also with Bernie Grofman at UC Irvine and Jonathan Servas at Carnegie Mellon University. And this is basically civics as seen by an engineer, where the engineer looks at the system and says, okay, there are two things that may have an action on one another that's positive. So for instance, voter polarization might lead to state legislators being polarized, and then the legislators and other elites may in fact get voters to be revved up. And so those are pointy arrows. Redistricting you can see here as a positive feedback loop where a legislature can ensconce itself in power by drawing its own map. So these are examples of positive feedback loops that when they run away could lead to instability. But you can also see checks on power. The governor vetoing something that the legislature passes, or perhaps the Senate vetoing something the president wants to do, like say appoint someone to the cabinet or whatever it might be. And so these kinds of inhibitions are inhibitory steps that foster stability, but of course they can also lead to inaction. And one of the difficulties of designing such a system is making it responsive to what voters want, but not too responsive. And of course, if one takes things out, the thing can work better, but it doesn't necessarily work better. If you've ever had the experience of taking something apart and putting it back together, you might, whether it be a watch or a toaster or something in your car, sometimes you take it apart and you put it back together, and oh, it seems to work a little faster. It seems to work better. Like I've had this experience, and my general experience is that that is a temporary phenomenon. But you know, if you take out, it would be attractive to take some of these inhibitory steps out. The anti-gerrymandering efforts of the last 5 years have been adding inhibitory steps. Okay, so what I want to do in the last few minutes is show you some evidence about ranked choice voting. This is an article by our former colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter, and Professor Slaughter and Simon have worked together on various kinds of reform. And one reform that's caught the attention of a lot of people who want to make democracy work better is the idea of ranked choice voting. The idea that if you, rather than just express one choice at the ballot box, you might like to express your first choice. If your first choice doesn't make it, then you mark your second choice, third choice, and so on. And if you make those rankings, and there's a rule for tabulating and accounting for those rankings, then you pick a winner, then it's possible to devise a rule that then leads to the most people being happy or the least people being unhappy, depending how you look at it. And this idea of ranked choice voting is something that's really gotten bigger and bigger in the last few years, and has become a desired reform by a lot of people who would like government to work a little bit better for them, at least through electoral rules. And so one question that is of great interest, I think, is, does ranked choice voting reduce polarization? So you can imagine it could achieve various kinds of things. It could get candidates to campaign in a more positive manner, to seek.
So I'm going to interject my ignorance here one more time, in that ranked choice voting is something that I've talked about before. I'm not sure that I can succinctly describe what it is, but basically what I think he is about to show is empirical evidence that ranked choice voting does take the extremes basically out of the equation. And how you do that, and we just voted on this in Oregon to get this passed, and I believe it did. And so basically what happens is you've got, like, you have a pool of candidates, and they can be separated by political party. They could not. It just kind of depends. But basically what happens is that you rank your choices, typically 1 through 4, right? To go through a first round of voting. And if your first choice doesn't make the cut because they didn't get enough votes, then they go to round 2 and they figure out, okay, who was your second choice? And then they tabulate those and they go, okay, did they make the cut? Did they get enough votes where we don't have to go to steps 3 and 4? No, so on and so forth, until they get the person out of, you know, the 1 through 4 ranks. Let's just say there's 4 on each side of the party. They're splitting by party. They figure out who, by ranked choice, won out of, you know, who won out of that 4 possible candidates on each side. And then they can actually do the voting ranked choice for the actual seat between the parties as well. And I love that he brought Sarah Palin up, because Alaska has ranked choice voting, and she lost. And actually someone, I can't remember her name, but she's an Inuit. She's a native to Alaska, and she is very, what I think most of us in the lower 48 would call very progressive. But in Alaska, it's not. So you kind of have to understand Alaskan politics to kind of get this idea. But basically, you know, Palin flipped out and didn't understand. I think her famous dumb fucking quote was, "I don't understand how you can get less votes and still win." And I'm like, bitch, welcome to the Electoral College. Like, that's literally why our system is so fucked, directly due to slavery, the 3/5 clause, and basically slaveholders freaking out when we were creating our Constitution. And, you know, basically, I think it was Virginia. I could be wrong on that. There was some southern state that had, you know, obviously heavy enslaved peoples. They were heavily, completely reliant. Like, people who were enslaved outnumbered the slavers, the white slavers, something like a 10-to-1 ratio. And because they couldn't vote, that meant that all the other northern states of the original colonies would basically always beat them out on a congressional and presidential level. And that's how they got the 3/5 clause. And that's how the Electoral College evolved out of that. So number one, that's kind of how ranked choice works, but that is a better choice than the Electoral College, because the Electoral College is skewed to allow states with lower population to have more weight in the choosing of the president than, say, like a state that has 10, 15, or 100 times the amount of population. And so this is kind of the sort of ideal that was, ingrained in, like, say, someone like me growing up in the 80s, one person, one vote. Well, that's not actually true. That's complete and absolute bullshit, right? Because as he was saying earlier, is that the last two Republican presidents, both Trump and Bush, won without winning the popular vote, right? And even this last one, as they're tabulating, they actually think now that this last election may be within 1 percentage point of difference. And so the point I'm getting on there is that the system is, and this kind of goes back to my original question, our system is fundamentally fucked from a voting side, from a representative side, and from a legal justice side. So my question is still, and I think I know where he's kind of leaning towards this, that ranked choice is the option. The problem with that is that ranked choice can only be instituted in certain states that allow voter initiative referendums to happen at the state level. We've already seen, after this happened a couple times, there are states like Utah, Idaho, Montana, South Dakota that are like doing all they can to basically take the power out of local voters and say whoever's in office, they get to decide the laws no matter what, right? And they're trying to change their state constitutions to basically exclude voter referendums. And so this is where my argument is going, possibly, to counter this idea that ranked choice is the way to go. Now, in complete theory, yes, ranked choice would be the way to keep our hobbling democracy alive, but you have to get, 45 to 47 states to enact ranked choice from a state level. Right now you got Congress covered, but then how are you going to fundamentally change that on a federal level, right, with an amendment to the Constitution? Now, theoretically, you could, if you were able to change it at a state level, let's say all 50 states did ranked choice, the ability for an amendment to pass, we haven't had one. I don't remember when the 27th Amendment was, right? I couldn't even tell you what the 27th Amendment even is, right? I don't even know, right? Most people think we only have 10 amendments, right? The Bill of Rights, that's all we have. There's nothing after that, no free rights for anyone non-white or women. That's literally in the Trump Bible. Anyway, my argument is that, yes, you could potentially get a referendum or get an amendment passed if ranked choice was instituted across all 50 states, and you had this idea that somehow you were going to change, federal law to not be so disproportionate. Another argument could be that if you were able to get it, across all the states, you wouldn't have to worry so much about who gets the president, because you've got ranked choice at the state level. And of course, Congress, the Senate, and the House could then balance out that presidential fascism. All of this is such a long-term possibility that I don't see happening with a second Trump administration. So I'm trying to counter the argument of someone who is clearly just a universe in difference in terms of intellectual and obviously, who is way more smarter than me, way more smarter than me. Wow. And obviously has a better grasp of physics and biology and neuroscience, which I absolutely love. I'm trying to counter that argument. Maybe I'm doing it really stupidly, but I really hope that I lose. I really hope that, you know, between him and the other professor, they're able to prove me wrong.
One another's votes, supporters, that is. It could, for instance, motivate candidates, give them an incentive to run towards the center. Okay, it could leave the possibility of voters getting more representation, even if they're somewhat heterodox in their views, and then they're in that third mountain, they still get some amount of say in the system. And so you can imagine the kinds of benefits that could come out of ranked choice voting. And you know, the question is, do those benefits emerge? And also, how big are those benefits? And there's a practical question in the last few years, which is, what if voters don't want that particular reform? Is there something that can do as well? And that's really where I want to go in the last few minutes. So the existing system, which I think we all know, is you have a closed primary where each party nominates one person. Democrats nominate one, Republicans nominate one, and then they run against one another in a general election. And this is just, I'm a little out of order here, but this left-hand histogram here is some empirical data we've gotten from voting records on how people are polarized. But imagine if people are polarized into these two great mountains of left and right, of Democrats and Republicans. If you just have two candidates, then in our simulations, we've set conditions so that each candidate wins about half the time. And, oh, I should have changed this. This is outdated. It's supposed to say D and R, not Biden and Trump. But anyway, but imagine if you have a simple system with just two candidates, then perhaps 50% of the vote is required to win. But now imagine if there's a third candidate. And there's been a desire in some quarters to run a third candidate. And the naive view is, oh, if we had a third party, that person could just be at the sensible middle. And if we had that, then everything would be lovely. And then we'd have a middle candidate and everything would be hunky-dory and we wouldn't have to have this terrible polarization. So under simple simulation conditions, the result is a little different from that. And the result is that this middle, imagine a candidate running here towards the middle in this like kind of beige zone. If a candidate's in this zone, what they can do is they can create an asymmetry where one of the candidates ends up winning and not needing 50% of the vote anymore, and the other candidate still wins 50%. The general principle, which I think anyone could understand if they thought about it a little bit, is that if you run someone who's in the middle between two candidates, that candidate tends to act to damage the prospects of the person they're closer to.
And this is why RFK, Jill Stein, whoever, all these fucking bullshitters on, you know, Putin's little payroll, they actually do damage what he's saying, right? They're looking to steal votes away from, in this scenario, Biden or Harris, to allow Trump to win not the popular vote, but win the electoral college vote. And notice what all these you fucking dipshits out there telling me that RFK was somehow principled and somehow, you know, independent and all that bullshit. I hope you well, you probably won't, but I hope you realize how fucking stupid you are that he just like immediately dropped out and praised Trump. And all you Jill Stein fans, go fuck yourselves, okay? We haven't heard shit from her since the election, and we won't until the next one, until Putin pays her again.
And so if you think about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when he was running for president this year, when he was thought to be closer to Biden or Harris, then he was deemed, like if you think about it, he was likely to hurt that candidate. And you only hurt the one you love. And so then if you think about Kennedy then being seen as being closer to Trump, then therefore closer to Trump. And if you watch the machinations of the campaigns, that explains certainly why, from a strategic point of view, the Trump campaign was very interested in sidelining Kennedy towards the closing stages of the campaign. So this is just a simple point that using the existing rules of the system, we might want a savior, but that savior might end up spoiling the prospects of what we really wanted to happen in the first place. And so under the existing rules of the system, a savior can become a spoiler. Okay, now this is not always the case. If we were not so polarized, if we run again these simulations now with less polarization towards the extremes, less bimodality, it becomes a system in which there are more voters collected at the middle, and now it's possible for that third party to sometimes win elections, and now there's still some measure of symmetry between the two major parties. And so one question is, under certain circumstances, this third-party idea might backfire. Under other circumstances, it might not backfire. And so this is one question that has been of really great interest to us as we've been working on this. Now, one of the reforms that, that has attracted a lot of interest is the idea of a top 4 primary. For those of you who don't know about this, this is a rule that is currently implemented in Maine and Alaska and and actually newly enacted, I think, in Washington, D.C. this year. The idea that everybody runs in one great big primary. So if you're independent, Democratic, Republican, you just vote. You check off who your favorite candidate is. The top 4 advance to the general election and then vote by ranked choice. Just some simple envelope calculations suggest that the number of competitive congressional districts, as I mentioned, that amount of competition has gone up in the last round of redistricting. And if even 1 in 20 partisan voters had complex preferences, such a reform could double the number of competitive seats. And so this is one possible way in which competition could be improved. So this is just one possibility. The bad news is that this reform, in fact, got a sound thrashing at the ballot box last week. And so there are democracy reforms on the ballot all over the nation. You can look them up at your leisure at this resource that I was linked with, that I helped create, votemaximizer.org. And there were reforms on the ballot all over the country. Things like letting everybody run in one primary, ranked choice voting, or nonpartisan redistricting. As it turns out, most of these reforms failed last week. And one of the problems right now is that reform itself, so remember I've been switching back and forth between the word repair and reform. Reform itself has adopted a partisan valence. And here, if you look over here, these are the vote shares of these various reforms. And you can see here, I will tell you that the Pearson correlation between the Harris vote share and the vote for electoral reform, that Pearson correlation is, I think, 0.89 or so. And so it's highly positively correlated, where 1 is perfect correlation. And you can see here that it's correlated, but it is weaker. It ran on, these reforms on average ran 5 points weaker than Democratic vote share. Now that's just as a contrast, abortion initiatives, right, ran 11 points ahead of Democratic vote share. So this is, in short, a graph in which reproductive rights are apparently bipartisan and favorable to voters of both parties. And then these repairs to democracy that I mentioned are bipartisan, but there's skepticism. And so there's a current challenge to persuading voters. And so this leads to a couple of problems. One is, okay, maybe it's a persuasion problem. Another is, well, maybe it's the wrong reform. And these 2 filled circles here are interesting because they represent things that did better than Democratic vote share and therefore might have had some kind of cross-party appeal. And these 2 filled circles are letting everybody run in one great big primary and also nonpartisan redistricting reform. And so they failed, but they ran ahead of the Democratic vote share. And so this is just to show you that there's complexity that needs to be addressed. Now, in the last couple minutes,
It's not complexity. It's just Americans are that fucking stupid.
I just want to show you something, a thing we're doing, and in a very researchy talk, I would have really focused on this. What we're doing is we're currently analyzing hundreds of hundreds of ranked choice elections in which instant runoff voting was analyzed. It was used in the election. And in those hundreds of elections, we've been using dimensionality reduction techniques to put all the candidates and all the voters on a single axis. So that red X there, imagine that's you. If you're that red X, then you might prefer candidate A to candidate B, and then you might prefer B to C and D, and you might cast the ballot A, B, C, D. But you could also imagine if you're somewhere over at this end of the axis, your ordering is D, C, B, A. And in both cases, your ordering is quite different. And yet, you both have the same view. And what this refers to is the idea that voters may have a single cognitive space in which they all view the candidates the same way. And we find that statistically, voters tend to act as if they view the candidates on one axis. This is a congressional election from a few years ago in Maine. And you can see here, this is a histogram of how the voters are. And you can see here in this particular example, the voters are bimodally arranged between the Democratic candidate, Jared Golden, and the Republican candidate, Bruce Poliquin, and an independent candidate in between. So we have a finding that if we analyze hundreds of these elections, we find that in partisan elections, which is the red histogram here, voters act more bimodal. They act more like they're piled up in these 2 big mountains. If it's a nonpartisan election, they act less that way, and in primaries, less still. And then likewise on the right, we take those elections and we sort them by US Senate versus more local elections. We can again see differences in the degree of polarization. And so the idea here is that voters act less polarized in nonpartisan and local races. And so we feel that that's probably an important starting point in starting to ask the question, okay, now that we understand how voters act in different kinds of elections, we can start asking questions like, how would they behave if we gave them a new rule? If we gave them approval voting as a rule?
Okay, so again, I'm sad to say that I think I'm in the right here, is that he's proposing a hypothetical fix, which again has to hypothetically get through, 45 to 47 states. Like, the probability of that happening is, again, I'm terrible at math. It's just got to be really fucking low based on literally information he just said here, right? When it comes to the gerrymandering, when it comes to, well, you know what? I'm going to let him finish before I start going off because I think he's about to transition. But I don't disagree with the idea, right? But this is the problem when we get to science, is that until we actually implement the fix, it's just math. It's just a probability, right? You have to actually do it to get the result, the accurate results.
Or if we gave them a top 2 primary as a rule, or whatever it might be. And so we're hoping to use this as a starting point to understand the hypothetical effects of future reforms, and hopefully using agent-based modeling to understand what may happen in the future. And our feeling is that I would say that we feel more urgency on this particular project than we did even a few weeks ago, because these reforms, if they are to deliver the promise of reduced polarization in the US politics, seems like might be a good idea to do that. Toot sweet. Okay, so starting to look at similarities. This is now into the weeds. I won't get into it because it looks like I'm out of time. But this is now representing all those hundreds of elections, and the similarity of 2 elections are similar to another, then we put them next to each other. And if they're less similar, they're further apart. This is a way of representing all the hundreds of elections in a single plot that is commonplace in quantitative biology. It's a kind of clustering called T-SNE. It's like neighbor embedding. But anyway, the idea here is that certain kinds of elections seem to be similar to each other, like board elections or representative elections or US Senate elections. And these spectra that we're calling them are similar to one another if the election is similar to one another. And so this is our beginning point for doing simulations in the future. With that, I thank you very much. This is now supporters of mostly Simon's research. He and I are both supported by the
So I think I was right in that, yeah, I don't disagree with anything he said, but I don't think it's going to fucking happen.
generosity of the Princeton Catalysis Initiative. And of course, we're both very fortunate to be here at Princeton University. And then Simon has been supported over the years and currently by these other organizations. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, that's in your way.
That's yours.
That's my notes. I apologize.
And I'm seeing something very technical here. I'm not seeing actually a computer screen, so.
Yeah, it's a little discomforting.
Do I just exit this?
I don't know.
Sorry. Hello, my name is Kina Lipsitz, and I want to thank Deborah today for having me here, and for Sam and Simon allowing me to respond. I should say I am very much, I'm a collaborator of Sam's, right? We've been on papers together. I also was part of the polarization workshop that Simon put together. So I'm still working on these projects, but I wanted to talk today about, what is keeping me up at night. And I thought I would talk about this. This is what kept me up last night. Okay. And the reason why I want to talk about Matt Getz is because something that I've been thinking a lot about, and this has to do with a project I did with Naomi Leonard in the engineering department, is it's polarization, but also about norms and political norms. So norms are ways of behaving appropriate, or understanding of appropriate behavior. And a lot of times, those norms are often, they're unspoken, right? It's just you observe people around you and how they behave, and that is what you accept as being what you should do, right? And so norms come from a lot of places, not just people around you. Maybe there are certain groups that you identify with, maybe partisan groups you identify with that can shape how you behave. And then elected officials are also affected by the norms of their office. And so those norms are set by their predecessors, right? And so the thing, after I was somebody knocking on doors in Bucks County for 2 months, and so I was feeling, I kind of was prepared for this election, but I was not prepared for this. And the reason why is, if you think back to when Trump appointed Jeff Sessions to be Attorney General, the one sort of norm violation that everybody was in a tizzy about was that he didn't have an Ivy League diploma. That was the concern, right? And so here we have probably the most unqualified person who has ever been nominated to be Attorney General. I mean, he has a couple things in common with his predecessors. He's white, he's a male, and he has practiced law. But he has no prosecutorial experience, and he's also, he's never been a judge, right?
So obviously this is being, I am making this video post Gates withdrawal and after the leaked ethics report that basically showed how he used his adoptive son's persona and online accounts to pay to have sex with a minor. Anyone who thinks that he wouldn't do this, and you're just kind of like, I guess, ignoring the evidence and more broadly ignoring why he and Trump are so like bond at that level, I guess. Birds of a feather and all that.
He's also somebody who's been under investigation by the Justice Department himself. So this is a pretty egregious norm violation to propose somebody like him. And then on top of it, the way that he is going to be probably, I think, that he's going to be pushed through is through recess appointments. And so, recess appointments, they're in the Constitution. A president has that power, and presidents have used them. Obama used them, Bush used them, but the Senate has pushed back by basically not having prolonged recess appointments. And that way they've sort of held on to their power to check presidential power, or in the nomination process. And what is very likely going to happen here, and we've seen President Trump already pushing for that, is that you're going to have recess appointments. These nominations, these candidates are not going to go through the normal process.
He's already talked about that, and even though like some people were pointing out that he didn't sign the presidential transition agreement with Biden to basically that would force FBI background checks on his administration picks, and Trump finally, signed that. But I think to myself, like, well, sure, if you're going to break the law, fuck does it matter if you sign something that says you're not going to break the law? Like, that's like telling a criminal, hey, we're going to put you in this jail cell, but we're going to leave the jail cell unlocked and opened, and you have to stay in there. Be a good boy now. Yeah, like that's going to fucking happen.
So this brings me back, we've seen these norm violations piling up over time, and they have come from both sides. Here we have, Pelosi tearing up, it was President Trump's speech during his first State of the Union address. That had never happened before. In fact, actually, what was interesting is Matt Getz was the one who, he filed a complaint with the Ethics Committee for this, saying that it was a flagrant violation of decorum. That's interesting. And then we have under Biden during the State of the Union address, we had Boebert jumping up and down, screaming "liar." Okay, so you've had these kinds of norm violations, but they've been getting more and more egregious. And so that brings me to polarization. So Sam, sorry, it's the S's. It's the S's, Sam. This is showing you how polarized the electorate and elites are in terms of both ideological and affective polarization, right? And so on the top, you have the masses, and you have on the left, issue-based, that's ideological polarization, and on the right, you have the affective polarization, right, which is the dislike, the loathing. And what's interesting is you have it actually compared with elites, and you see elites on both measures on the bottom, both ideologically and in terms of affect, are even more polarized than the public, right? And what does that lead to, particularly affective polarization? Is it leads to the norm breakage, the norm violations, right? So not only, if you dislike the other side, you get people saying, okay, well, we're justified in doing this because the other side is evil, right? And then on top of it, it also reduces accountability for actions. So you get not only people, citizens in the party saying, well, it's fine. If Trump has this kind of nomination, that's fine. But also within the own party, that reduces accountability as well. And so, when you think of, egregious norm violators in the past, the Joseph McCarthy's, the Nixons, some of the loudest critics came from within their own party, and that's what made, bringing them down sort of credible. We now have the Republican Party is essentially the party of Trump, and so you can't count on the party for holding him accountable. And so rebuilding norms is very difficult. I just really loved this moment from one of the recent, the last debate. I don't know if you know, under Biden, the debates that he and Trump had, they never shook hands. And so Harris was determined. She chased him across the stage, and you can see he's not happy about it at all, right? But there was a lot of risk involved in that, right? She could have been refused. He could have somehow tried to humiliate her, right? So the point is, norms are really hard to rebuild. And the thing is, and this is from the project that I did with Naomi, is that polarization it's not going away, and it's getting worse. And so what we did, and this is what I love about the models that people like Simon and Naomi use, is that they allow for feedback, positive feedback. The idea that you have one thing leads to another, and that thing again comes back around and keeps pushing it forward. And so you have these processes they're not linear, right? And I think in political science, we tend to use more linear models. And so what this is showing here is we were trying to understand the asymmetry in polarization. This happened to be ideological polarization. And what we know is that Republicans have moved more to the right than Democrats. And what we did in our models, we brought together public opinion, an aggregate measure, which is called policy mood, which shifts back and forth over time. So usually what happens is that when Democrats are in power, policy mood becomes more conservative, and when conservatives or Republicans are in power, policy mood becomes more liberal. And so it's like this sort of counterweight. And what's been happening is public opinion is not functioning in the way that it has. And so it's become slightly more conservative. And then that combined with the feedback that you get on both sides, when you think about feedback, that's the money, the social media, the party discipline, all of those things that sort of keep driving the polarization. What our model shows is public opinion is the feedback is the polarization is too far gone to be pulled back, at least not by public opinion anymore, right? And so Matt Gaetz to me is very much explained by this. And so when let's come back. We'll come back. We'll come back to him.
when I think about all of these reforms that we're trying to come up with, he is from a very safe district in Florida. It was won by Trump by over 30 points. He has no real primary competition. So even if you opened up the primary, how do we address this? And so, part of me thinks that we should absolutely keep doing this kind of research. But the other part is it just rearranging chairs on the Titanic? So anyway, I will end with that.
I will agree with that it is rearranging chairs on the Titanic.
We have just about 10 minutes, and so what I'm going to recommend is just to take a round of questions, and then we'll just turn back to the two of you. All right, I'll start. But I do want to just highlight two axes that I hear that are really critical, and then maybe to ask a question that I recognize is impossible to answer. Because one set of themes that was coming through is how do we explain the electoral outcomes that are in play? So why we get one candidate over another, and part of the answer there is that the discussion was about the kinds of institutional changes that might shape the kinds of electoral outcomes. But the second is once people are in power, the modes of accountability that would affect what people do in office. Some of that is institutional, right? So those veto points, that's what we would call them in political science, or the other kinds of mechanisms that Sam noted. The others are about norms, and that's really the point also that Kina was raising. So when I was stepping back, this is a fundamental debate in political science. Institutions versus norms, ideas and interests versus other things, agency versus structure. I guess I was stepping back and thinking, what kinds of perturbations, that's the term that you use, right? So something that disrupts really might shift. And here the question is, to what degree can man-made, women-made, people-made interventions matter as opposed to conditions that we inherit? And so what I mean by the second is sometimes we might say the economic crisis was so severe, it was the economic conditions that led to outcomes. Maybe it's really not about ideology and affect, but maybe it's about just voting the incumbent out because there's other things that are going on. So really the big question that I'm leading to is, as you've thought about your work, to what degree are these perturbations actually human-made versus conditions like economic structure, economic crisis, and the like? So that's my question. I've given you a moment to think. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm Eduardo Batia, visiting professor at SPIA. Wonderful. Thank you so much. My students do a 6-week seminar on polarization, but basically the reaction to polarization. How can societies that have been polarized, have there been case studies of leaders who have taken them out of that polarization? And we look at Northern Ireland, we look at Nelson Mandela, we look at some communities here in the US that have been more polarized than we are here in America right now. And basically the work of a leader or a number of leaders have actually made them get over the finish line. And I wonder if there's something there that you can share with us in terms of, how to, other than the research, how to effectively deal with that.
And then we'll take one more question from Griga.
Thank you. So I guess the question that I have that goes a little bit to both Sam's presentation and Kina's comments is, to what extent we think that some of these electoral reforms that Sam talks about would be able to pull elites back from this polarization, right? If you have these kinds of open primaries and top four and so on. And then conversely, whether the fact that such reforms might push towards the center might explain why these reforms end up not being very popular, because basically elites that are highly polarized see themselves as potentially losing to more centrist candidates, and what the implications of that are.
Why don't we start with you, Kina?
Okay. So I think Deborah actually, and maybe Grigo, would be better equipped to respond to your question. Although that is something that I have thought that actually could, and it's not institutional. It's very individualistic, and we as political scientists don't like individualistic sort of responses. But like, our political leaders behaving better. Like if you had some, what if all of a sudden Trump tomorrow, started behaving like a kind person. I think it would have dramatic effects. I mean, and there's lots of work that shows in political science that like people follow their leader. We all look to these our role models, or not role models, but like people we trust, and we behave like they do. We believe the things that they tell us to believe. So I think that could make a difference. I was going to say in response to Grigo, so here's where where Sam and I sometimes run into issues is I am a political scientist. I see all those independents, and my question is, really, are they independent? Because research shows that really only about like 7 to 10% of those people are not committed to one party or the other. Most of those independents vote they're just as partisan, or they behave in just as partisan a fashion as people who say that they're with a party. And when I think about the reforms and them being enacted, there's a whole history in this country of Democrats and Republicans basically colluding to shut out third-party competition, right? And so, they're
Like my boy Bernie, huh? Just the latest example.
and they don't like these reforms. We have lots of evidence of that now, where they don't like things like RCV. So yes, that is definitely a concern. But Sam.
Yeah, the nice thing about answering second is it buys a little bit of time to collect thoughts, which is very helpful in this case. So one, to address these questions, first globally with Eduardo's question, and then to go to the United States in particular. To echo Kina's point, elites have a lot of say in what people end up getting. And although it may be that voters in the United States many of them did not necessarily want a huge change, those votes are going to have, in all likelihood, a fairly outsized effect politically. And so when we have elites, if I think, now I'm not a comparativist, I don't know very much about other than what I read in the newspapers, but two examples that come to mind are peacemaking in Northern Ireland and also in the former Yugoslavia, right? So these are places that had fairly intractable conflicts. And then there was some intervention and some thing that happened that caused people to come together and have relative peace.
Yeah, it was everyone else, like a local fundamental war for fucking 3 or 4 decades, right? Like, how do you just blow by like the issue of the IRA, which I'm not even gonna fucking touch because there's so much historical context there that I am just not like well educated on. In Yugoslavia, if I may be showing my ignorance, but I thought Yugoslavia was former USSR, and I'm like, it's been in constant turmoil at least up into, I want to say, the mid 2000s, I think. I don't know, my memory. I know Yugoslavia even less than Ireland, so take that with a grain of salt. But I mean, that is the thing. That is the turning point, is fucking violence, right? And we know now that 100% that fucking, chump neo-Nazis are 100% okay with being violent. What the fuck do you think they're going to do?
And I have just casually noticed remarkably little tension among friends of mine from those parts of the world when they talk about each other. And I keep on expecting them to be more tense about it, but they seem to be okay with it. And so I think that comes back to Keena's point about elites. In terms of whether these repairs to democracy can be helpful, I would say there's two kinds of ideas that come to mind, both from Simon's slides, which I got to study for today, and also from Keena's. And I would call those two ideas fire breaks and federalism. And so we think about fire breaks, this spatial heterogeneity of the way that people polarize leads to this sort of nationalization of politics, where these national great forces of, say, non-college whites and college-educated people, or whatever it might be, there are these great forces that, played out at a national level, seem to work against discussion and seem to work against amicable resolution of conflicts. But one can imagine that that people who are interested in preserving the kinds of liberties and system that they have are used to having these be enforced at a national level. But maybe one answer is to have these things, to find our inner federalist and to think, well, maybe the way to preserve what we have is to take more advantage of local mechanisms to do that. And so, sort of building fire breaks between states. As to whether these repairs can work, I would say that we're actually in the middle of doing an experiment of finding out whether the existing repairs could work. They haven't gotten very far, but I will say that that in fact, one of my favorite topics to study over the last few years has been gerrymandering, and at a federal level, the playing field is far more level than it was a decade ago. We are now under a condition where whoever casts more votes is likely to have more seats, and that's indicated by the fact that the average district vote margin this year is about 1% favoring Republicans, and the median seat is 1.4% favoring Republicans, and that's a net advantage of no more than 1 or 2 seats away from a perfectly majoritarian House of Representatives. So the closeness of the House of Representatives right now is in fact a reflection of reforms that people have worked very hard on over the last decade.
I just want to make sure, because again, me being one of these dumbass fucking Americans, the House of Representatives and the House of Senate are both Congress, but 2 different houses, right? The House of Representatives is actually that. It is more representative of the diversification of Americans than the Senate, I think, will ever be. And in a way, it was technically designed to be so. But again, I think that the reforms that he is referring to when it comes to gerrymandering have helped a lot. It's just that it doesn't really amount to much when the gerrymandering on the Senate side hasn't been fixed, and actually I think has gotten worse. Because for those who don't know, and maybe those who don't live in America, you lucky dogs, to get a law passed, the House or the Senate have to introduce a bill. Then they have to vote on it. So let's say the Senate introduces a bill. They come together, they do the discussions, they vote on it, and then it goes to the House, and the House has to vote on it. If it passes the House and the Senate, it then goes up to the president for veto or sign it into law. That is like the schoolhouse rock basics of how laws are passed in this country. There are a lot of different ways now due to needing to get around the filibuster that was instituted, I think, like, I don't remember. I think it was like the 60s. Shit, I could be wrong on that, but it's like basically it's a newer mechanism that has basically stalled Congress's ability to basically pass any laws without giving in to the minority. And this is also another reason why we haven't had amendments for so long, is because that polarization that they're talking about has been increasing. And I'm still going to put the blame solely on Reagan for his fundamental Christian views and what he allowed in the defunding of higher education through federal way. wasn't a complete, but it was like a massive blow to higher education. And so that's why you'll still have like grandparents being like, I went to college in the 70s and I worked part-time and I had no problem. Yeah, that's because it only cost $7,000 for your entire fucking degree. Now it can cost like $30,000 a year for that 4-year degree. And Reagan is the president that I will lay at his feet and be like, this is his fault. And this has to do I'm going off track here a little bit. But this has to do again with the overarching polarization and the ironic rhetoric by, as he said, non-college educated whites who lean almost exclusively Republican, that they sit there and say that they don't want elites running the country, and yet that's all they vote for. Like, the only two non-elites that I can think of that are in Congress are Boebert and Marjorie Taylor fucking Greensore, whatever her name is, right? I think those are the only two that do not have an Ivy League degree. Like I said, like Trump, everybody, like seriously, anybody else in the fucking federal government that you can vote for has an Ivy League degree. Fucking Ted Cruz, who name it, right? What's the guy, the eye patch, the Bond villain from Texas? I forgot his name. He went to Harvard. Like, all of them. Tom Cotton, that fucking traitorous piece of shit, he went to Harvard, or it might have been Yale, but you get the idea, right? So there's this sort of, this is the con job of the last like 45 years that the Republican Party is so successful at, and Donald Trump is the fucking master of conning uneducated, scared lily white snowflakes in this country into voting for him, even though, like, literally he is the antithesis of who they want running the country, because he lies so much. And this is, I make this analogy to the Bible. There are so many contradictions and lies that they can just cherry pick and choose what they believe, and they are justified in it, whether it's their religion or their justification for, you know, voting Trump in a second time. I just don't see how, I don't see how it's going to work.
Of the seats that were decided or will be decided that are within a margin of 7 points or less, 7 of those races are decided in a reform primary known as top 2, where the reform is basically people who do not have to look over their shoulders at being primaried. And so that's 7 seats. And that 7 seats is guaranteed to be more than the margin of the majority in the House of Representatives. And so there is a faction of people in the House who do not have to worry about being primaried by their members of their own party. So, you know, is this enough? I don't know. I think we're about to get a real life experiment. And, you know, I generally don't advise that the patient inject themselves while they're ill, but you know, maybe we're going to get some answer to that. And I would say that, you know, preparing for the future is a matter of looking ahead now.
I'm just going to stop this right now. All right. We already know what the answer is. People, the American public, had a choice. And I'm not sitting here and saying that Harris, you know, did a flawless campaign, as so many on the left and the media spheres talk about. No, and Walz was probably the best VP. Like, I would have voted for Walz for fucking president over Harris. I couldn't believe he was picked. I think he is like the ideal progressive president potential. But anyway, there is no experiment to be had. America chose Trump. America doesn't want a president. They want an authoritarian. They want a king. They want a theocracy. This is what they voted on. This is who we are as a nation. There is no possible inoculation to this, right? Like, we already know what the outcome is. We just don't know. How do I say this? We know it's terminal. We just don't know if it's going to be slow or quick. That's the only question we have left. And so on that, as much as I enjoyed this discussion, as with so many academic discussions, it doesn't really lead us to anywhere other than digging deep into the theory behind what could potentially fix something, but we don't actually have a way of doing it. There are no steps laid out, and I understand that's not like, that's more of an engineer. That's not a neuroscience. It's not a political scientist jobs. That's an engineer job. That's the electrician's job. That's the construction worker jobs, right? They're the ones who eventually like figure it out, turn it on, and go yes or no. And yeah, I look at them as the voting public, and yeah, they flicked the switch, but it was to our electric chair.